When you think of America's most secure prison, what comes to mind? For most people, it's ADX Florence, the infamous Alcatraz of the Rockies. But what if I told you that before ADX ever existed, there was another prison, a place that wrote the rulebook for modern Supermax confinement? This is the story of USP Marion, the original Supermax, and the brutal events that changed the American prison system forever. Our story starts in the quiet, unassuming town of Marion, Illinois, in the early 1960s. The notorious Alcatraz had just been shut down, deemed too old and inhumane for the modern era. The Federal Bureau of Prisons needed a replacement, a state-of-the-art fortress capable of holding the nation's most dangerous criminals. USP Marion opened its doors in 1963, not just as a prison, but as a symbol of progress. It was designed to be a model of control and, believe it or not, reform. Every inmate had their own cell, the guards were trained in psychology, and the official mission included rehabilitation. But that idealistic vision didn't last long. By the 1970s, the population inside Marion was a who's who of the criminal underworld. It held notorious killers, powerful gang leaders, political radicals, and legendary escape artists gathered from across the country. The atmosphere grew tense. The dream of reform quickly evaporated, replaced by an undercurrent of fear, violence, and extreme isolation. The walls of Marion began to close in, not just physically, but psychologically. Without anyone realizing it at first, this prison in the Illinois cornfields was morphing into something entirely new, something the world had never seen before, the first true Supermax in American history. Then came the day that changed everything. October 22nd, 1983. A date forever burned into the history of the federal prison system. On that day, inside USP Marion, two correctional officers, Thomas Klutt and Merle Klutz, were brutally murdered in separate, coordinated attacks just hours apart. Both killings were carried out by members of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang known for its terrifying discipline and ruthlessness. The message they sent was chilling and clear. The administration had lost control of Marion. The response was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, the entire prison went into an unprecedented lockdown. Every cell door slammed shut. Inmates were confined for 23 hours a day, only let out for brief, solitary showers or lonely exercise in a cage. What was initially meant to be a temporary emergency measure became permanent. For the next 23 years, USP Marion remained in a perpetual state of lockdown, the first of its kind in the nation. It was no longer just a prison. It had become a laboratory for an experiment in total human isolation. Inmates communicated by yelling through solid steel doors. Meals were pushed through small slots. Human contact, once a daily reality, became a rare and highly controlled privilege. Quietly, the Bureau of Prisons studied this new model. They observed, they documented, and they learned. The lessons learned from Marion's lockdown became the foundational blueprint for the even more extreme facility they would build years later, ADX Florence. What was life actually like inside that lockdown? Imagine waking up every single morning to the sound of metal clanging on metal. Not footsteps, not voices, just the cold, sterile echo of a world made of steel and concrete. Inside Marion, time itself seemed to warp. The days, weeks, and months blurred into an indistinguishable stretch of grey. Inmates described the experience as living in a box inside another box. The psychological toll was immense. Some men lost their minds to the crushing solitude. Others adapted by becoming harder, colder, survival machines sculpted by silence and deprivation. The guards patrolled the corridors with military precision, observing every movement from behind reinforced, bulletproof glass. The prison's architecture was a tool of control. Its design allowed officers to see everything, while the inmates saw almost nothing but the four walls of their cells. For many prisoners, basic communication became a clandestine art form. They developed secret codes, rhythmic knocks on walls, taps sent through the plumbing, and whispered messages carried through the ventilation shafts. It was their only lifeline to their own humanity. And yet, despite the near-total control, the violence never completely vanished. It just went underground, becoming quieter, smarter, and far more desperate. Marion had become a prison within a prison, a place where hope was a dangerous luxury and sanity was a fragile thing to protect. As the years of lockdown dragged on, stories from the inside began to slowly leak out to the wider world. Human rights organizations started raising alarms, labeling the conditions at Marion as a form of psychological torture. Former inmates, released after years of isolation, described a world devoid of sunlight, meaningful conversation, or any sense of purpose. They spoke of the deep psychological scars left by the silence. The world began to ask a difficult question. What happens to a human being when you take away everything but their own heartbeat? By the 1990s, the government was already drawing up plans for something even more extreme. They envisioned a new facility in the remote mountains of Colorado that would take Marion's model of isolation to its technological and architectural limit. That place would become ADX Florence, the Supermax of all Supermaxes. But Marion was, and always will be, the blueprint. It was the silent foundation upon which America constructed its most feared and controversial prison. Even after Marion's permanent lockdown finally ended in 2006, its long shadow loomed over every high-security facility in the country. It had proven that isolation could be weaponized as a form of control, and that absolute control could become an institutional addiction. For years, the public only saw the exterior of USP Marion, the coiled razor wire, the imposing concrete towers, the cold, symmetrical design of a place built for one thing: control. But behind those walls, there were human voices, voices that refused to be silenced completely. Letters from inmates who had spent decades in solitary confinement began to surface. They told haunting stories of hallucinations, spiraling paranoia, and broken minds. Some wrote about staring at the same four walls for so long that the walls started talking back. Others described the profound silence not as peace, but as a kind of living death, one you could still breathe through. As one former inmate powerfully wrote, "You don't count days here. Days count you." These chilling accounts echoed through prison reform groups, newsrooms, and even the halls of Congress. The question grew louder and more urgent. Is this justice, or is it something else entirely? But within those same walls, another perspective existed. The guards and administrators who worked there often saw the system as a grim necessity. They viewed Marion as the only viable way to manage men who were committed to chaos and violence. They argued that without places like Marion, the entire federal prison system would be consumed by anarchy. For them, the lockdown wasn't about cruelty, it was about maintaining order. That fundamental debate, the clash between security and humanity, began right here in Marion. And it's a debate that continues to this day. By the early 1990s, the Bureau of Prisons was ready to perfect its model. They began designing ADX Florence, a prison built directly on the lessons and the mistakes of Marion. The core concepts were identical: single inmate cells, tightly controlled movements, and the guiding philosophy that total isolation equals total control. But at Florence, they took it to a whole new level. Technology was used to replace human contact almost entirely. Cell doors lock and unlock remotely. Hundreds of cameras watch every corner, 24/7. Inmates are confined for 23 hours a day, and their only view of the outside world is a narrow, 4-inch wide sliver of sky through a reinforced window. The officials who helped design ADX Florence openly admitted their debt to its predecessor. One stated, "Marion taught us what worked and what didn't." Florence became the perfect, chilling evolution of Marion: colder, cleaner, and virtually impossible to escape. But its DNA, its very soul, was born in the cornfields of Illinois. Every sterile corridor, every strict policy, every rule of life at ADX Florence carries the unmistakable mark of the original Supermax. Years after the permanent lockdown began, psychologists started studying the long-term effects of Marion's isolation. What they discovered was chilling. Men who had survived years in those cells couldn't function in normal prisons anymore. They would flinch at the sound of footsteps. They couldn't hold eye contact. Some found they couldn't sleep unless the lights were always on, a grim reminder of their constant surveillance. Even after being released, they carried Marion inside them, a mental cage that followed them everywhere they went. But the toll wasn't limited to the inmates. For the officers who worked there, the psychological price was just as real. They reported nightmares, crippling anxiety, and a deep, gnawing sense of moral conflict. One former guard confessed in an interview, "You start to forget they're human. And one day, you realize you've started to forget that you are too." That was the quiet, devastating truth about Marion. It didn't just reshape criminals. It reshaped everyone who walked through its gates. By the 2000s, mounting pressure from human rights organizations forced the Federal Bureau of Prisons to rethink its methods. Marion's full, permanent lockdown was officially lifted in 2006. Today, it operates as a medium security facility, but it houses a special unit known as the Communications Management Unit, or CMU. This unit is designed to closely monitor certain inmates, particularly those with ties to terrorism or sophisticated organized crime networks. Even in its modern form, the spirit of total control remains palpable. Every phone call is recorded. Every letter is read. Every word is watched. But for those who know its history, Marion will never be just another prison. It stands as a powerful symbol of America's struggle to balance security with humanity, and a stark reminder of how easily one can completely erase the other. Inside its quiet corridors, you can still feel it, that lingering tension, that unsettling sense that something, or someone, is always listening. Marion's influence didn't stay confined within its own walls. The model it created spread like a virus through the American correctional system. Supermax facilities inspired by Marion began to appear across the nation. Pelican Bay in California, Tams in Illinois, Red Onion in Virginia. Each of these institutions was built on the same core principle: complete control through absolute isolation. And while policies have shifted and politics have evolved over the years, one fact remains unshakable. Marion proved that once a prison system learns the art of isolation, it's a lesson that's incredibly difficult to unlearn. It set a precedent, a blueprint that would go on to shape decades of incarceration in the United States. But deep down, behind all the steel bars and reinforced concrete, a haunting question still lingers. If Marion was the answer, what, exactly, was the question? Over the decades, a few of the men who endured Marion's darkest years began to share their stories. They appeared in interviews, documentaries, and even wrote books. They didn't portray themselves as heroes, nor as simple victims, but as survivors. They described, in harrowing detail, how profound silence could strip a man down to his very core, until there was nothing left but guilt and memory. And how, for some, that suffocating silence paradoxically became the only place where they could find a semblance of forgiveness. One former inmate, after serving 20 years in solitary confinement, said quietly during a rare interview, "Marion didn't destroy me. It showed me what I already was." Those words resonated deeply with everyone who heard them. Because Marion wasn't just a physical place, it was a mirror that reflected not only the violence of the men held inside, but also the cold, calculated inhumanity of the system designed to contain them. Outside those walls, reform movements began to gain traction. Documentaries, high-profile lawsuits, and congressional hearings started to question whether the entire concept of the Supermax prison had gone too far. But inside, the legacy continued. The same grey walls. The same suffocating silence that, once experienced, never truly left. It's easy to forget that USP Marion wasn't just a prison. It was the economic heartbeat of a small Illinois town, a place where it seemed nearly every family had a friend, a neighbor, or a relative working behind those formidable walls. For decades, the townspeople of Marion lived side by side with the men society feared the most, separated only by layers of fences, barbed wire, and the wail of sirens. When the permanent lockdown began in 1983, the town changed almost overnight. Local businesses that depended on visitor traffic closed down. School bus routes were permanently rerouted away from the prison. And the sound of that morning siren, tested every day at 10 a.m. sharp, became an inescapable part of daily life. Some residents said they grew used to it, that it just became background noise. Others admitted, in quieter moments, that they never really did. For the people of Marion, the prison wasn't just a facility down the road. It was a constant, humming presence. It was always there. They watched as news vans from national outlets came and went, with reporters describing their home as the most dangerous place in America. But to them, it was just home. The irony was impossible to ignore. The town and the prison were locked in a state of mutual dependency. One couldn't exist without the other. By the time ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, opened its doors in 1994, the world had already come to accept the idea of total control as a grim necessity. The rise of international terrorism, sophisticated organized crime, and widespread gang violence were all used as justifications for building newer, harsher Supermax facilities. But those who remembered the origins of this model, those who remembered Marion in the 1980s, knew the truth. Marion wasn't built out of a grand strategy. It was built out of fear. It was a raw fear of chaos, a fear of rebellion, a fear of losing control within the very walls that were designed to maintain it. And that fear, more potent than any concrete, stronger than any steel, became the true foundation of every Supermax prison that followed. The architects and designers of ADX Florence even admitted it years later, saying, "Marion showed us how to stop violence. We just forgot to ask what it would do to the human mind." Even today, Marion holds inmates under its CMU program, a modern form of surveillance that has replaced the physical chains of the past. They aren't in solitary confinement, not in the traditional sense, but their every move, every word, every thought expressed is watched, analyzed, and digitally stored. Some might call this progress. Others would call it a sinister evolution. What's the real difference between Marion in 1983 and Marion today? Technology has replaced the old-fashioned locks. Sophisticated algorithms have replaced the human guards on the cell block. And yet, the system still operates on the very same principle, achieving control through silence and observation. The walls might look different, the cells might be newer, but the core idea hasn't changed. It's just become quieter, smarter, and in many ways, invisible. When you look closely at its modern operations, it's hard to tell if the experiment ever really ended. There's a hallway inside USP Marion that few people ever get to see. It's lined with old cell doors from the lockdown era, bearing scratched names and rusted hinges. It's completely silent now, but if you stand there and listen, really listen, it feels like the air itself still remembers. The guards who worked those years say the silence never left them. The inmates who survived say the same thing. Some can still hear the phantom sound of keys clinking down the empty hall. Others remember the low, constant hum of the fluorescent lights that were never, ever turned off. Marion isn't haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense. It's haunted by memory. Every bolt, every wall, every shadow on the floor tells a piece of a story that America once tried to forget. The story of a prison that was never meant to become a national symbol of isolation, but did anyway. Over half a century ago, a place was built that would forever change the American justice system. It wasn't just a prison. It was an idea, a philosophy written in concrete and steel. This is the story of USP Marion, the original Supermax, and how its shadow still stretches across America today, not as a piece of history, but as a chilling warning. Lawmakers and prison officials still study its blueprints. Reformers still cite its name when they talk about the devastating effects of long-term isolation. Marion's story begins not with a grand design, but with failure and fear. In the early 1970s, the federal prison system was grappling with unprecedented violence. The old model of rehabilitation was collapsing. Then, in 1983, two separate, brutal murders of correctional officers within hours of each other at Marion became the catalyst. The response was swift and absolute, a permanent lockdown. No one knew it at the time, but this emergency measure would become a blueprint. The era of the Supermax had begun. What does a permanent lockdown mean? It means 23 hours a day, sometimes more, in a 6 by 9 foot cell. Food is passed through a slot in a solid steel door. Human contact is almost entirely eliminated. The goal was simple: total control. To contain the uncontrollable. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, a terrifying new reality emerged. The silence inside Marion became a form of punishment all its own. In government archives, thousands of pages of memos, incident reports, and psychological evaluations from Marion's lockdown years are still stored. Reading them, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. No one planned for Marion to become what it did. It was a slow creep, a series of small compromises made in the name of safety. A decision here, a new policy there. Each step seemed logical at the time, a necessary response to a perceived threat. But together, they built a monster in plain sight, a place where the line between security and cruelty simply vanished. The lockdown was no longer a temporary emergency. It had become the new normal. This is what makes Marion's story so profound. It wasn't just a facility for housing inmates. It was a laboratory, an experiment in human endurance and control. And the results of that experiment would echo for decades. Researchers would later coin a term for the psychological collapse they witnessed in men subjected to this environment. The Marion syndrome. It was a slow, invisible, and devastating deterioration. Inmates who spent years in isolation lost their ability to trust, to think clearly, even to recognize their own reflections. Some refused to speak at all. Others couldn't stop talking to the walls, desperate for any response. They forgot what real silence felt like, their world reduced to the constant hum of fluorescent lights and the metallic scrape of food slots opening and closing. The Bureau of Prisons defended the model, claiming that without the control unit at Marion, chaos would rule the entire system. But for the men trapped inside, chaos was no longer the enemy. The real enemy was emptiness. A former inmate managed to smuggle a letter out in the late 1990s. In it, he wrote a sentence that reveals the true cost of Marion's experiment. Here, I stopped fearing death. I started fearing life. That, more than anything, was the price of total control. Not just the broken bodies from prison violence, but the shattered minds left behind in the silent aftermath. Stand in front of Marion's gates today, and you won't see the monster that history remembers. The walls are weathered, the town around it is quiet. The prison itself was downgraded in 2006 to a medium security facility. You'll see open yards, inmates moving with a degree of freedom, and programs aimed at rehabilitation. But beneath that calm surface, the ghosts of what this place once was remain. Inside, the old control unit still stands, sealed, unused, a dusty monument to a dark chapter. Guards who have walked its empty corridors say you can feel the air change, as if the walls themselves hold a memory of the intense pressure and despair they once contained. Every scuff on the floor, every faint scratch on the walls tells a story of men who lived and vanished in the same small space, year after year. This isn't just an abandoned part of a prison. It's the birthplace of an idea that would spread across the nation. Every Supermax prison that came after, from California's Pelican Bay to the federal government's ADX Florence in Colorado, carries a piece of Marionist DNA. The philosophy born here is more than just steel and cells. It's a belief that human behavior can be perfected through absolute control and isolation. But the silence inside those walls whispers the truth that Marion learned first. You can cage a person's body, but you can't cage the human mind forever. And sometimes, the psychological toll of that silence becomes far louder and more destructive than the violence it was designed to prevent. The world remembers Alcatraz as the symbol of escape, the ultimate challenge to a prison's power. But Marion became the symbol of something far more modern and perhaps more terrifying: containment. It proved that a prison could be built that was stronger than violence, stronger than fear itself. But in doing so, it created a new kind of fear, one that would ripple through the justice system for generations. Today, Marion's legacy isn't found in riots or dramatic headlines. It lives in the quiet breath of every person who has ever sat alone in a cell built from its design. It exists in the ongoing debate about solitary confinement and its impact on mental health. And it forces us to confront a difficult question: how much control is too much? There's a strange irony in Marion's story. The most feared prison in America was born from the failure to rehabilitate. Yet, decades later, its legacy is now teaching the system what not to become. Marion didn't just create the Supermax era. It also forced America to question if it could ever end it. The lessons written in its concrete walls are still being read today, a constant reminder of the price of silence and the enduring human cost of absolute control. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten histories. Your support makes these stories possible. Stay curious.